If you build it, they will come.
Ooh, I'm hearing voices, I think. This also, I think, means we're talking Kevin Costner tonight, his new movie, Horizon. This is Alex from Los Angeles.
And this is Karen from Los Angeles. Welcome to Movies That Shaped Us. We're two longtime friends who grew up on opposite ends of the globe with very different backgrounds, but were both shaped and are still being shaped by the movies we see and love. In each episode, we will cover a filmmaker who shaped our love of movies. So join us as we explore why they matter to us before reviewing the three movies in the filmography that made the biggest impact on us.
So, Costner. This is our Kevin Costner episode. He has this big new movie out. He put a lot of his own money on the line. So we're definitely excited to talk about that film, what we thought about that. But I can start on just what Kevin Costner signifies to me. And it's interesting. We're recording this episode a couple days after 4th of July. And to me, Kevin Costner from very young age has always been the embodiment of America to me. He's always represented in like a positive way what America could be, what it stands for, even cheesier like iconography. I mean, he's in so many baseball movies. I associate him with baseball, which is, obviously the ultimate American sport. But, I mentioned cheese. I think that to me is a big part of his persona. Like what America can mean in a very cheesy, kind of schmaltzy way where, yes, sometimes it can come across as so sincere that it's like too saccharine and you maybe it might not work. And sometimes in his movies, I think that's the tone when if you nail that tone well, he works perfectly in it. And if you can't really pull that tone off right, or he's trying to do something that isn't as like heart on your sleeve, so incredibly sincere, he just doesn't really work. But what about you? How was he impacting you growing up in India?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this while preparing for the episode. I feel like I've known of him, obviously, but I don't think I'd watched a movie of his growing up. I don't think he
Hmm.
fully made it to India, and that's maybe telling as to how quintessentially American he is.
Hmm.
Other stars of his generation, like Tom Hanks and Tom Cruise and all, like they obviously translated and were, global movie stars. And I would say Kevin Costner is a global movie star, but
Hmm.
not to that level, perhaps. And maybe it has to do with the very American
Hmm.
ness of it all, perhaps. But I feel like I've always known him through the movies, even though I don't think I'd watched too many of his films. So
Hmm.
it's been an interesting ride kind of preparing for this episode. But I agree, like when I think of him, I think of America. And the other thing I think of, which I'd read about, so this is not a hot take, but
Hmm.
he does have like a very golden age of Hollywood kind of leading man vibe. He might think of himself as Clark Gable or what have you, but to me, he's more like Gary Cooper or maybe even Henry Fonda,
Hmm.
like somebody idealistic, obviously very good looking, very classically American, kind of intellectual in the sense that he's wears his heart on his sleeve, a little bit restrained in his emotions, but to me at least, maybe not the sharpest tool. Like I don't think of him as an intellectual
Right.
actor. I don't think
Hmm.
of Gary Cooper as an intellectual actor. So he kind of falls in that mold really beautifully. And it's interesting that this is somebody whose heyday was the 90s,
Hmm.
So it's amazing that somebody like this comes along in a modern time and can exhibit those same values and the same kind of a movie star. Very hard to do. So, yeah, it's been interesting to just think about his career and the longevity of it, even though he seems like somebody from a different time.
Yeah, yeah. I was when I was rewatching the films for this, I was thinking a lot of Jimmy Stewart of that.
Oh,
The
he thinks
not
he's Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
I actually think he's the modern Jimmy, not like the Vertigo Jimmy Stewart, but more like the Mr. Smith Goes to
Yeah.
Washington type of Jimmy Stewart. And it is interesting too, thinking of his heyday, which was like late 80s, early 90s. And I think that type of actor and that type of persona was accepted by the culture. And then as we turned into the more like ironic, quippy, like sarcastic, sardonic era
Self
after
aware.
all of a sudden like he doesn't work, and that is sort of when his career takes a major kind of dip. And it wasn't only till recently where he's kind of coming back through television and Yellowstone, like reaching back to an older audience that I think still appreciates stars like that, like the old school Hollywood, which I don't really think the younger generation, it just comes across as too cheesy, I think. But
Yeah.
I like that cheese a lot in the right way, and I think that's what I love about him. And you bring up the old movie star thing too. I think also what he's sort of, to me at least, encapsulating as well as this like classic Hollywood, like a representation of that. Like I'll never forget that speech he gave at the Oscars about 2 years ago when he gets up on stage. It's like, yeah, when I was a kid, I went and saw How the West Was Won, and I was
Mhm.
transported to this other place, and just talking about the power of movies and almost like
Mhm.
tearing up. I almost cried when he was giving this speech. It was just, for me a memorable speech that night. But I think he just represents that type of like Hollywood that just loves the art of film and wants to and believes it is important for society to have this. And I think that is also something that is missing from a lot of the newer kind of generation of Hollywood even coming up in the 90s and 2000s. And I just love that he's pushing for that. I think that also kind of goes into like his new movie a bit too in terms of what he's trying to do. And I respect that a lot too. I like that he's one of the people there on the front lines trying to save Hollywood or preserve Hollywood or whatever you want to say there.
Yeah, I do stand by, and I like that. I just don't know if it's working. And
No,
we'll
right,
get
fair.
to
Yeah.
that, especially with this movie and sort of what he's now become. Because I think he's too much cheese. When you eat too much cheese, it can get to your head. And I think
Mhm.
that's what's happened here.
Yeah, yeah. I
Versus
get
if you're just in the cheese business where you're selling cheese, that's okay. But if you start eating the cheese that you made yourself, things can go a little wrong. So that's my take on him, I think.
fair. Yeah, I mean, I just respect the fact that if he's putting money into making the cheese, like he's now putting his money where his mouth is and saying, I'm just
I
not going to,
know.
talk about Hollywood needs these things or this Hollywood means this. He is putting his own like financial future on the line for nothing but, I mean, I guess you could look at it as arrogance, but personally, like I
Yeah.
don't really see that with him. I think it is more this desire that he has to save the movies. Let's jump into his latest film then.
Yeah.
We've been talked about enough about Costner. So his latest movie is Horizon, an American Saga, Chapter 1. I love movies titles with punctuation. That's got a lot of it in there. The IMDb plot summary chronicles a multifaceted 15-year span of pre and post Civil War expansion and the settlement of the American West. Directed by Kevin Costner, starring Kevin Costner, Sienna Miller, Sam Worthington, and Luke Wilson. I should say too, like, we say chapter one in the title there. This is a planned of 4 chapters that he will be releasing over the next 2 years. Hopefully, I mean, he has the second one's already
Hmm.
in the can, releasing next month, and then he's filming chapter 3, and then trying to get financing to complete it, and then film 4. So hopefully. He does complete it. That's my take on this. I am a big, like I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, that I do associate, Kevin Costner with America and based on movies, but another one is the Western, which is a quintessential American genre. I was happy to see him come back to this. And while it was a very interesting experiment in terms of how the narrative was structured, like it did feel very much like 3 TV episodes back to
Yep.
back. It did not at all have a movie narrative in terms of how the plot moved. And I enjoyed this a lot, actually. And I will definitely be there for part 2. I think the best thing you can do when a movie is over is end the movie in a way where like makes you feel good. And there's an ending montage where he's like, this is sort of next time on Horizon kind of thing,
Right.
where it was like a 3 minute sequence of just shots from the next movie. And I was immediately like, yep, okay, I'm sold. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I'll get more into my more specific thoughts on it, but what was your take as someone who I don't think is as big of a fan of westerns as I am, which I'll again admit that's one of my favorite genres.
Yeah, I'm not. And but I would say it's something that more than horror, it's something that I really want to get into. And I think through the making of this podcast and watching The Untouchables and a few other movies that you put on the list, like I'm really intrigued by the genre. So I think I'm very warmed up. I just haven't had the time to watch more of the classics. So
Hmm.
but I think this was interesting because maybe I know too much about the backstory of the making of this, like how this Kevin Costner was on the Yellowstone, which, a huge hit TV show. And then
Hmm.
whatever spat happens between him and Taylor Sheridan, who's the maker of that TV show. And then he basically comes out, it seems like, and it feels like he's like, you know what? I'm going to make my Yellowstone and it's going to be on the big screen. That's sort of what it feels like to me, that this is a TV show put on the big screen. Did I have a good time? I would say, yeah. Like it was pretty interesting and enjoyable. I will say it feels very much like a TV show, not just in its narrative structure, but also the way it just looks and feels. And even though the West is beautiful, especially the second chapter in the first chapter, all puns intended, when Kevin Costner shows up, I think they're in Wyoming. Like that whole
Hmm.
area is just absolutely stunning. Like you want to go to all these places, but I wish he'd shot on film, but I guess there's no money left. Maybe make one of these or two of these opposed to like 12. It'll look so much better and more impactful. But there's something about the storytelling of how these things are disconnected. And I get it. Like it's all going to converge towards this land horizon, but I don't know, something about the storytelling, the way it looks, and the fact that you're also surrounded yourself with all sort of B actors. They all are sort of TV actors or movie actors who are kind of in the B tier. The whole thing just doesn't really hang together super well for me, even though there's some memorable sequences, I will say that, but I never felt the weight of it. To me, like westerns are, from whatever little I've watched, the emotion I associate with them is that of sort of soulfulness and kind of really thinking about the past and thinking about the future and what shaped us. And of course, there's also the story of archetypes. And I think the archetype piece does come through, but otherwise it sort of fell a little flat to me. And I just kept thinking of that this is a little bit of a vanity exercise, and this kind of goes back to the arrogance part that, oh, I'm just going to make my own thing. And it made me think of him and his career in a larger sense, where he's not really worked with the best of the best. And I associate that with people who are arrogant, or maybe don't want to lose control, or are maybe even threatened by other people. Like you can see his fingerprints across the whole thing.
Oh, yeah.
And I wish he'd collaborated on this movie and maybe many other movies in the past, maybe 20 years with some people, whether actors or screenwriters or whoever, who are at the top of their game, And we'll get into that more as we go through the episode. But he only worked with some best of the best people when he was starting out. Since then, he hasn't, and I think it caps you. And I see that in this movie. If this is like the summation of his work and trying to say movies, I think it's held back because it's just him, and you can only get this far on your own.
That's fair. I mean, I think getting more into like the business thing in this, I mean, he's not in the movie for the first hour. That was actually really surprising to me. And then he does get that incredible sort of like hero's entrance where the camera, like he rides into the camera and there's that swell of the amazing score, and they're in this big, amazing Wyoming plane. And I'm like, okay, Costner's here. Like, this is great. Because in the first hour, which is dealing with this beginning settlement out in New Mexico, where there's this really actually very well done Indian raid where, the Native Americans come in.
That's actually very well shot.
That was cool, even though I'm like, okay, I don't know who these characters are, but then you eventually get to know them over the course of the rest of the next, 3 hours. Like the pacing of it was very much like, okay, here's episode 1, where you're meeting some guys, a big thing happens, and then those guys like get affected by, what happened on the raid. Episode 2, we have another storyline of now Kevin Costner coming in and what's going on in Wyoming with him being like this man with no name type gunslinger who sort of comes into town and how he gets involved with this kid. And that storyline was, in my mind, the most interesting one. Like much like in a TV show, sometimes you're not really going to care about certain characters and the plot's going to kind of slow down a little bit. And I felt like that in terms of the pacing. But I think if it was a vanity project, it would have been more about him, is what my point was. And he is an actor on screen, even though those are my favorite parts. And I kept waiting for the Costner storyline to come back. It wasn't just all him. Postman, for example, a movie I guess I'll say we're talking about later in this episode, he is like front and center of that. He wrote, he co-wrote it, he directed it, he is in almost every scene. And I think that this is definitely not something like that. And on the arrogance thing, which I know he's been heard to be difficult to deal with sometimes and very has a vision in his head and trying to execute it on the screen. But, he did win Best Director on his first going of making a movie. And I think that does go to your head immediately. So it's like, why would I work with other directors? I want to get my own projects off the ground, because not only was Dances with Wolves, the first movie he directed, very financially successful, but also it won Best Picture and Best Director. So I think that makes it harder for me to like, okay, let me step back and now be in some other director's hands. Like that's tough. So maybe that success came too early in his career, which I think is definitely valid. But I also respect that he has this artistic vision that no one else wanted to do Dances with Wolves. And he cared so much about that story that he actually made it happen, and it was a huge hit. Postman went the other way. And then Open Range, another Western that he made, is actually his previous film to this that he wrote and directed from, I think it was 2003. A really awesome Western, like really solid. Again, a story that I don't think any other director would have pushed for to be told. And I think that's another great movie. So that's what I respect about him. And with the Horizon, even more so because he's putting his own money into it, which is like the one thing you're never supposed to do in Hollywood. Like
No.
never put your own money in, but he's doing it. And I think that's cool. And this experiment also narratively of, what if we took television in terms of a narrative style and approach and just put it in theaters? Will people show up? Will it work? I was very mixed on that will it work thing until the end of the movie. And then I sort of was kind of getting what he was doing. And I've been thinking about this movie ever since I saw it last week, and definitely going to be there opening weekend for part 2. And it's kind of cool to have like a TV show that you're getting to go to the movies for. I don't know.
I don't know.
It's working for me. Like I'm definitely, was this the best movie I've ever seen? No. Was it the best thing he's done? No, but I'm there for it. And I think it's only going to get better as they started weaving in more of like, what's the point of this? Because in the first, actually most of the movie, I was like, hey, what's really the point of this? Like, what is he trying to get at? None of these characters are meeting. What is he trying to say? And I think at the end of the movie, when they showed that montage, and it's really making it clear that it's this story about this quote unquote town called Horizon. And then some guy back east is selling land out here, and people are settlers are going out there, assuming that this is going to be their new life, that everything's going to be great. And it's really hard. And then also there's other people that live there, the Native Americans. And it's like, wait a second, what's going on? And it really reminded me actually of a previous episode we did. I think it might have been our first America episode, where you were making this point that America is all about like marketing, essentially. Like we have these things that we quote unquote stand for, but it's not really real, but it's like we're trying to always sell this idea of what America is. And I think that eventually might be his thesis with this entire project, because the movie's about this idea of this town Horizon, that you can go west and it's going to be this paradise and this Eden, and go, it's going to be great. And all these people are going out there for their own individual reasons, but it's not, because it doesn't exist. And it seems like there's going to be some twist where, Giovanni Ribisi seems to be revealed as like the bad guy, this guy selling this land and lying on these flyers. And maybe he doesn't even own rights to the land, because it seems like the Native Americans are like, why are these people showing up? This is currently our space. So that to me is like, when I realized that, like at the end, I'm like, okay, this is sort of what the point of this is. It makes me even more excited to see where it goes as those themes start like getting hit on the head a little bit more. Then it was really just setup of all these characters.
It's just set up.
Set up with no payoff, which was, it's sort of, the movie kind of just ends, but it ends in a way where I was also comparing this to like Dune Part 1, which I found very unsatisfying as a first half. That movie, to me, those two movies feel like one movie cut in two. So it ends without like a second, or definitely not a third act. I'm like, okay, this feels really weird. Like I didn't like how I felt when I left the theater after Dune 1. Whereas this, it just sort of ends. And I'm like, okay, there's a next episode next week kind of thing. Like I know the narrative is unfolding, and I don't feel so unsatisfied in a way. But I don't know. What did you think about the ending?
Yeah, I mean, I would not compare this to Dune. I mean, I know in what sense you're saying, but like Dune 1 is an amazing experience with the way it's put together, the way it's acted, the world building, all of it is totally incomparable in my mind. In fact, I even prefer Dune 1 over Dune 2. I'm not bothered by that aspect that it's sort of chopped up. Yeah. And I think Dune 1 is fairly contained in my mind.
It didn't really work. It doesn't work for me without the second one.
But this is like I don't know what, just stick to TV or make a movie is what I would say. And the numbers are telling the truth, right? Like this is a bomb, and I don't know if anybody's going to show up for part 2. And I feel
we'll see.
Some people will. I mean, surely it sounds like you are.
I'll definitely be there.
But I don't know how big of a thing it's going to be, just given how much has been spent on this, So, yeah, I'm all for experimentation and trying things out. So, props for that. But yeah, I don't think this works.
Yeah. I think that for me, the jury's still out until all 12 hours of this are done. But so far, I'm willing to go where he's going to go. And yeah, this is an experiment for sure. And maybe it's not going to work. But I also, whenever directors or studios or whatever try something, I just respect that. Like I like the, sort of Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas kind of experimentation thing where they're just going to try stuff. And sometimes it totally doesn't work, but sometimes it does. And I like that Costner is in that same camp too, where he's wagering himself to try something and in a new way. Like maybe this could be movies. Now, it's probably not going to be, but I like that
Yeah.
he's doing something instead of just what the studios are doing, which is churning out, more Despicable Me's and more Marvels. And
Right.
like that's what they like. That's not going to be. You got to do innovate. And
Yeah.
sometimes you innovate and it doesn't work. But
I agree.
yeah,
I just think like the format is one thing. I just think that the character development and, I wish he was working with better people. If you
yeah,
don't
the
have
act,
much on the page, then
yeah,
if you have good people, they'll bring the story. The truth is that the script is very light. There isn't much character development and the whole thing looks like a TV show. So to me, those are the big
mm,
things. It's not so much the episodic treatment, because if this was the best movie he wanted to make, who cares how long it is? Who
hmm
cares how chopped up it is? I will show up. The truth is that it's not great, and you're asking so much from your audience. You're putting your whole life on the line.
yeah,
Make it great. If you're going to experiment, go out with a bang. And I don't think this is what that is. And
yeah.
that's my
Yeah,
issue.
that's fair. I just keep thinking about this as if this was a show and I've watched now 3 episodes, would I continue on the season? The answer is yes. So then why wouldn't I want to show up in the theater? That's at least my like mental calculation. It's like
True.
I wouldn't
Yeah.
stop watching the show. I usually give shows at least one season anyway, but it isn't so boring or so uninteresting and none of it works
No.
enough where I'm like stepping away. But to your point, it's a much bigger ask to pay another $25 and go to a movie and sit in a theater for 3 hours than it is to just hit next episode on the
Right.
remote and then the story continues. So this very easily could have been on TV. And part of me even wonders that in terms of the financial structure that he has in terms of owning this entirely, that if he can't get part 4 finance, he might turn around to a TV network and say, look, I'll cut this up into
Yeah.
episodes. You just finance the final 3 episodes, but everything else is already done. And
Yeah.
there's very interesting ways from a business standpoint
I
he can
totally agree. I
he
think
can
it will
move
come
forward with
down to
this.
that.
It could. I hope it doesn't because I want to be there when part 4 comes out with all the other Horizon fans dressed in costumes for our favorite characters, sitting there in the theater, like, cheering when something happens. That's what I want, but I just want the story at the end of the day to be finished. If he can't get it in theaters, then, I'll be there on Disney Plus or Netflix or whatever is around by the time he gets this
I
thing out
know.
the door where this
Gazebo
thing is on.
TV.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so now we're going to get into our top 3. So first, we're going to start with our first love, and this is the movie that made the impact on us personally first with Kevin Costner. Then we're going to get to the masterpiece. This will be the movie that each one of us thinks is Kevin Costner's best, that resonates with us the most personally. And then finally, Wild Card. This is some other Kevin Costner movie we want to bring in and talk about. So, Karan, why don't you kick us off and go over your first love of Mr. Costner? What do you got for us?
Okay, so my first love is The Bodyguard from 1992, starring Kevin Costner, of course, Whitney Houston, Gary Kemp. Quick logline: a former Secret Service agent takes on the job of bodyguard to an R&B singer whose lifestyle is most unlike a president's. What?
Okay. Okay. That's okay.
Directed by Mick Jackson and written by Lawrence Kasdan, a name that we will hear several times on this podcast, I
That's
think.
right.
This is at least my first memory of a movie that has Kevin Costner in it, but I think it has more to do with Whitney Houston and the music, because this is an all-timer in terms of soundtracks goes. I mean, each of these songs is absolutely incredible. And it's sort of at the height of, I guess, both of their powers, because Costner is coming out of this amazing run of movies.
Mm-hmm.
Whitney Houston, obviously one of the biggest stars in the whole world, trying her hand at movies. But as a movie, I think this movie is okay in terms of its storyline and depictions. But I think what really stands out is the chemistry between the two of them. Kind of moving to me what the two of them had between each other in this movie, but maybe even in real life, like how
Mm-hmm.
he went to bat for her. And I think his comments on Whitney Houston's death and his presence at his eulogy, all of that is just so moving to me. It kind of goes back to what you were saying up front, right? Sort of that version of America of kind of do the right things. And sometimes it can be schmaltzy, but I like it, and this movie and the making of it is all kind of that to me. And how he pulled this off, it was apparently his note to Whitney and the makers that I will always love you, which has to be a cappella without any music.
Hmm.
When she starts singing, like all of these stories are so incredible to me. And, talk about sort of the arrogance or lack of it. I think in this era, there's just such assuredness to his confidence that he's not the star of the movie. She is,
Hmm.
and she's
Hmm.
the one who wins the movie. She's really great, even as an actress. And it's great casting. Like you want somebody who's just so famous and so good in real life that you're immediately drawn to them. And Whitney is a powerhouse, on and off screen, right? Like you
Hmm.
just cannot not be enveloped by her charm and her beauty and her talent, like all of it, right? And that's what the movie is too, that he's sort of slowly getting enveloped by that, and all he has to do is sort of show up and look great, and but also have this push and pull with her in terms of chemistry, and how he's a sort of hard edge person who then starts to kind of dissolve a little bit as the movie goes on. And I mean, all their scenes together, the first date that they have, like there's such memorable scenes. But yeah, curious what you thought of this movie, and had you seen it before?
So I had not seen this before.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I as much of a Kevin Costner fan as I was growing up, and even to this day, this just never I just
Hmm.
never checked it out. It's funny, actually. This reminds me of the discussion we had. I can't remember the topic we were covering, but we talked about the movie Rachel Getting Married, which I really liked. But the poster was so bad, I never saw it.
Eh.
This is similar in that the haircut of Kevin Costner just turned me off. I didn't like how
Mm.
his hair was combed down in the front. I prefer his hair more back and to the left, if you will say, than the front comb over piece. So I didn't see the movie because of his hair. And
Wow.
yeah, but now I finally did, and damn, this movie is fantastic. I was blown away by this. I just, yeah, everything worked for me. And the strongest thing about this film, in my opinion, actually, was the script is so amazing. Like the way that they deliver the beats of the story, they set things up, they're weaving in backstories in ways that feel organic to the characters. They're giving you like very subtle clues of like where Kevin Costner, his character came from, what he is, what his motivations are. In the beginning of the movie, he shows up at her house and she's clearly doesn't really care about security, and he's there deciding whether he wants to work for her. And then basically is like, you know what, you're an amateur, like I'm not gonna do this at all. And then he walks out and then immediately sees like her son. And then he's like, oh, okay, well, she's gonna be in danger too. So it's giving him motivation to be like, okay, maybe I'll kind of go back and think about this little, it comes at the right time. And while I've heard the song, I Could Always Love You, right? The Dolly Parton cover that they gave. And it was always fine. Like I was never really the biggest Whitney Houston fan. In
Mm.
this movie, when they set up that song as an organic part of the plot, when they're in the bar and it's like someone else
Right.
singing it and they talk about what the song means, I was like, oh my God, movie, I cannot believe you're doing this. Like, I
Eh.
know where this is going. You're going to play it at the end. I'm going to be in tears, which I was. I cried at the end of this movie. I thought it was so proud.
Great
Like,
ending.
everything worked in this movie for me. Even his hair, I honestly didn't bother me in this. But yeah, I put a lot of the credit to Larry Kasdan, who wrote the screenplay. This is his first screenplay that got him notoriety, and then he went on to write, for Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and then had his own kind of career as well. But this I just thought was one of the most incredible story scripts that I've seen. And yeah, it was fantastic. I get into some more thoughts, but I don't know, did that stand up to you? As I actually thought it was kind of okay. But do you see what I mean about like hitting the beats and knowing exactly how to deliver what they needed at that time?
Yeah, the movie does that really well. And it's sort of, taking us back to the 90s. Like, this is a blockbuster movie which has all the glamour and the sheen, but is also dramatic and has
Hmm.
thrills and, all of that. Like, they really don't make him like this, as they say it.
Yeah, they
But
really
there
don't.
is, yeah, but there is stuff with like the sister and, the guy who's sort of the stalker or whatever. Like, all of that stuff is kind of doesn't really come together in my mind.
It's
Like,
the red
what is
herrings. They're red herrings. The second they showed the
exactly?
sister in the beginning, I'm like, okay, well, she's involved. Like, and I love movies like that. That you see her on the first frame, I'm like, okay, she's probably involved. And she is, but then she kind of isn't. Like, I liked how they kind of were able to make her the bad guy, but not really, because the hitman that she
Yeah.
hired, she can't, control anymore. I'm like, okay, that was cool movie. I get it. I like this, where she's not Anyway, I thought that was cool. I those parts worked for me really well. Oh, okay, the stalker, of course, he's not going to be the guy, but you got to like tease it a little bit so the audience doesn't know. Like
Yeah.
those are just classic, things. That worked for me when
Yeah,
movies
I
could do
don't know.
that.
I'm okay on those. But I think, yeah, what stands up is their chemistry, their relationship, and just this whole world, right? Like the
Mhm.
world that they're built around this super famous person and how immature they can be, but also how talented they are, but they also are real because they have real life, like the sun and what have you. So I think all of that is absolutely incredibly done. And his haircut is the way that is because this movie originally was reading about it was supposed to star Steve McQueen and maybe Diana Ross.
Oh,
So he
oh,
sort
an
of literally
homage to
took
that.
on the Steve McQueen haircut.
Oh, see, McQueen can pull it off. I don't know if Costner can as much, but
I think he
it
looks great.
it didn't bother me as much as at least I thought it was going to. So I'm glad I got over that hump. And then speaking of Kevin too, I think you kind of hit on it in terms of, with the America thing again. Like I think in this, it's sort of like this male masculinity of like the quiet kind of protector.
Mhm.
He's not intellectual. He's not also a brute, but he's sort
No,
of that quiet, sort of stoic type who is just doing what he's doing because, it's the quote unquote right thing to do. And something else that I also think Costner does in the all of his movies actually is they're all political, but they're political in the like apolitical sense. Like it's just pro America and not pro individual like American ideology. Like, okay, he
right.
he was a bodyguard for Jimmy Carter, a Democratic president, and a bodyguard for Reagan, a Republican president, and he's just
Hmm.
protecting the president, the idea
Hmm.
of the presidency, and not like any kind of specific like political ideology. I think that goes through all of his films, which again I associate with that sort of America's greater than all the political parties and ideologies thing.
Right.
Again, for better or for worse, but there is that through his films. And the other thing that kind of struck me, and I'll kind of mention this as we go through each one of these films, because I'm sort of surprised by this, is these sort of allusions and homages to older films. Like this movie, as Kazan says, is very much inspired by like samurai movies. For him, like this is sort of like the bodyguard is like the modern day samurai. He goes around and,
Huh.
gets paid by protectors. And there's a scene in this movie where you see Yojimbo, the famous Kurosawa samurai film that he's watching. They show it in the movie as like a way to
Right.
really put a
Yeah.
hat on that. And I'm like, oh, so Costner knows Hollywood history and he's
Yeah.
paying homage to an older movie, which surprisingly I noticed in most of the other of these films that we're going to cover today, especially the ones that he have a lot of creative control over. Like he tips his hat to classic Hollywood, and I think that just goes to show like he's just a big fan of Hollywood, the medium, and movies. And I
Yeah.
like when that can be done in a tasteful way and not just sort of hitting you over the head over like, oh, we're
Right.
watching this, but it's like, no, we're going to put this in here and just kind of tip our hat to that. So I thought that was cool. And it makes that whole scene with the sword sort of work a little bit better too when they're kind of having this
Right.
flirtation over this samurai sword. It's like, okay, he's supposed to be a modern day samurai and and the samurai doesn't get the girl at the end, like in this movie
True.
too. I think
Yeah.
that works. So I'm glad I finally saw this. I think if I saw this again, I'll like it even more. It was like at the first time, I can't immediately be like, this is one of my favorite movies on the first viewing. That's very rare for me to do, but I'm definitely gonna be watching this
I'm glad to
again.
hear that.
It's so good. Just as a like you said, classic '90s. They don't make it like this anymore, and I just love it.
Just the bigness of it too, right? Like a movie
Yeah.
like this if it were made today, it'll be like some like cheap looking Netflix movie, even though it might have great stars, but it won't be shot in real locations. The
Hmm.
music would be bad, the concerts would not look good, and this movie just looks big because
Yes.
they spend money on movies like these before.
Yeah, and that comment you made earlier about sort of the blending of the genres thing too.
Yeah.
That last sequence in the movie where there's going to be the assassin probably going to show up at the Oscars, and she has to go and give
Mhm.
this maybe accept an award, but go up there and present one of the Oscars was like on my seat, like riveting thriller of like,
Yeah.
oh my God, where's the guy? What's going to happen? And earlier it can handle the romantic scenes very well and sort of these mystery scenes very well. It's like all the genres kind of like blended in one, and each one they execute like absolutely perfect. Like then that whole ending scene at the Oscars, I was so impressed with that. Like it got me. I was like, oh my God, like where's the guy? Who is it? Is she gonna get shot? Is Kevin gonna get shot? Like what's happening? Like I was so invested. So yeah, and it was great. Yeah, this movie was really good.
I'm
No
glad to hear that.
notes.
All right. Well, what is your first love of Kevin Costner?
So my first love is Field of Dreams from 1989. The plot summary: Iowa farmer Ray Kinsella is inspired by a voice he can't ignore to pursue a dream he can hardly believe. Supported by his wife, Ray begins the quest by turning his ordinary cornfield into a place where dreams can come true. This is directed by Phil Alden Robinson, starring Kevin Costner, James Earl Jones, and Ray Liotta. So this definitely was the first movie that I saw of Kevin Costner. This is one of those movies as a young kid, was definitely like in heavy rotation. Be on TV, I'd watch it. I'd rent it at the video store. Put the impression of Kevin Costner being sort of the quintessential American guy, Midwest, cornfield, baseball, like all those things kind of rolled into one. And I also just love this story too, like around the same time when I was in probably like sixth or seventh grade, like read the book this was based on, and it was a great book, and then saw the movie again. And this movie, I just think for me was always a classic as a kid. And a lot of it was to do with Kevin's persona and how he could handle a movie, which is, especially upon this rewatch too, incredibly cheesy, like incredibly like full on, cheese schmaltz. But, it absolutely worked for me a lot as a kid when I didn't even realize it was that cheesy, with like the score being really heavy handed by James Horner, and, these really sweeping, epic kind of camera shots in these cornfields where it's like, this is kind of cornfield, but it really works. And, there's heavier themes here at play too around, dreams and letting go of the past, and relationships with the father, which is again a sort of a quintessential kind of American thing too, with masculinity there as well. And it gets me every time at the end of the movie when he asks his dad to play catch. It's just like, it's super cheesy, but it totally works. And I think that also encapsulates Costner to me too. He's cheesy, but he can work. And I still love this movie a lot. I think it's a classic, throwback to like a Jimmy Stewart, Frank Capra kind of thing for a modern audience. I'm curious what you thought of this baseball cheese here. What were your thoughts?
I'd never seen it, which is, kind of shameful to admit, but like I said, he just never really made it to India. And then, of course, I've been aware of this movie forever, but just never really had a chance to watch it. And I don't know, I totally agree. Like, it works, it just is so earnest and sincere. But I think even though it's cheesy, first of all, I'm totally okay with cheese. Second of all, cheese works when the people making it really believe in it. And it shows, right? Every fabric of this movie, every performer, every choice that was made, everybody behind in front of the camera, they're all bought in. And I think when you see that, no matter what you might be putting up on screen, if people come together and buy into something, the product is going to be great and people are going to love it, and because it does touch something, like you said, those themes are universal. And those themes are true to who we are as people. And they do a great job to just touch that, and it's amazing. And to the point that you start to think that, oh, are all these people real? And it's such a clever thing with James Earl Jones's character. Like, I kept wanting to read up, like, is this a real author? Because some of the other people are like, that's such a clever trick of the book, I guess, and then of the script as well. And again, perfect casting. And everybody is great. Like, I think his wife, who I was not expecting to be this person who's kind of a firecracker and supports him, but also has her own mind. And that whole scene in the town hall assembly, whatever, where she really explodes, like incredible stuff, and just their home life and the dream. Like, I wanted to move to the cornfields and do this. Like, it was so amazing. Like, it kind of really draws you in. But at the center of it is him, obviously. I mean, he looks amazing, first of all, but has this kind of amazing intelligence, but also not intellectual, believes in something, but is also not dumb. Is confident but also vulnerable. It's such a amalgamation of so many different emotions, and this could have been played in a very stereotypical way, that somebody who's very corny and believes in all the things, or somebody who's maybe too hard-edged, and he's none of those all the way to the extreme. This is a kind of in the center character, and just his physicality, like, he doesn't say much, but every move of his face and his body, like, all that is just so perfectly calibrated that you just can't look away. It just has so much screen presence and star power and charisma, but it feels very grounded. And there's a famous thing, right, that he's been talking about even on the Horizon Part 1 press tour, that they originally were thinking of casting Robin Williams, and they said, the director was like, well, if Robin Williams heard voices in the cornfield, people are going to be like, of course, because Robin Williams probably does hear voices,
Yeah.
versus, if you, as Kevin Costner, are hearing voices in the cornfield, people are going to struggle with that in a good way, that they'll
Hmm.
come on board that, oh, yeah, if he's hearing it, something must be up,
Mm.
And that is so true. Yeah, this movie is incredible. And I wish I'd seen it before as a kid, and now I'll be watching it more and more.
Yeah, I think what you were saying about the character he represents and sort of this simple but not dumb. And to me, that is the version of American kid from the Midwest is a simple guy, but not stupid
Yeah.
and has a belief in something and will fight for it. And is a lot about, family issues too, where he's, wanting to connect with his dad to make sure he also connects with his daughter and all this kind of stuff like that. That is, again, why I think from the get-go, I was always associating Kevin with this like idea of the American
Right.
male. I also, it was funny too when you mentioned James Earl Jones' character. As a kid, I did think that was a real guy, like the real author. I did and even when I read the book when I was like, I don't know, like 10 or 11, I'm like, oh, cool. This is like this real guy. Who is he? And this is before the internet, so I couldn't like Google the name and
Right.
realize like, oh, wait a second, this is fake. But it just lends sort of this air of importance in the story and in the film. And on this watch too, what struck me is, similar to what I was mentioning in the Bodyguard, just in terms of like the structure being so great. This movie's not very long, and in the first
No.
5 minutes, he's in the cornfield hearing voices.
Right.
Like, there's not a giant like, okay, we got to establish what's going on here, and like, who's this person? What's his backstory? They get right into the story
Hmm.
beat of like what's going to happen in this movie, and it's very economical in terms of
Hmm.
how it moves. And I respected a lot on this second watch of like, oh, this movie's actually very well paced,
Yeah.
written, moves, and isn't very long. And I think that's why, as a kid, I could watch this. It's like an hour and a half, or maybe even under an hour and a half. So when I'm like 10, it's easy to put this on as opposed to something that's like 2 hours. When you're a kid, that feels like an eternity, let
Yeah.
alone something like a Lawrence of Arabia. It's like 3 hours. Like, I don't even know what that time means. That's
Right.
like the entire length of a day. So this works really well too. And again, it was funny that I was mentioning in Bodyguard with the Yojimbo piece, there is a scene in this movie too where they're showing Jimmy Stewart's Harvey, which
Right.
is the movie where he's talking to a potentially invisible rabbit. And
Right.
I think that's, again, an illusion of like, oh, I'm doing Jimmy Stewart. We're going to put in a scene referencing this Jimmy Stewart, and also hearing voices in the same way. So that caught me of like, oh, okay, I see. I'm
Yeah.
sure that was a Kevin note. I mean, I don't know, but I feel like that's something that he would want to just, put a little lampshade on that and be like, yeah, this is me, is my Jimmy Stewart phase.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. And then we didn't even mention Burt Lancaster. Like,
Yeah.
all these people are cast for a reason, and they bring a lot of, it's really smart because they bring a lot of depth and grounding to the movie. Otherwise, this
Hmm.
movie could feel a little bit too airy and wishy-washy. And I think it's just really smart. And on the American Ideal, they sell it, and maybe it is marketing, but often if something is being marketed, I think there is a kernel of truth there. And then the marketing becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that is about the greatness of this country, I think, because
Hmm.
anybody else could have marketed this, but they didn't. Or if they tried to, they didn't do a good job. And not all places became what this place became, So, and this thing of a simple guy who's not dumb but believes in something and is going to go out there and do it, that doesn't exist in a lot of places, coming from I grew up in a different place, and
Hmm.
this is not what people are driven by. I can't generalize, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I
So,
think
and
that's
he
that's true.
sells it.
Exactly. Yeah, he totally does. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's a great film. So I'm glad they built it and you came, I guess. Okay, so now let's move on to our next category, which is the masterpiece. This is the one film of Kevin that resonates the most with us personally. So, Karan, why don't you start with your masterpiece for Kevin? What do you got for us?
All right. So my masterpiece is Bull Durham from 1988, directed by Ron Shelton, written by Ron Shelton, starring Kevin Costner, Susan Sarandon, Tim Robbins. Quick logline: a fan who has an affair with one minor league baseball player each season meets an up and coming pitcher and the experienced catcher assigned to him. Again, I'd never seen this movie before. And I was like, well, we're doing Kevin Costner. This is obviously his Hall of Fame.
Mhm.
I need to watch this movie finally, and was completely blown away by this movie. Like, the fact that this movie exists and the time that it was made in is completely unbelievable to me. from every choice of casting, how each performer, the three leads, how they are playing, the world that's built in this movie, just from the warm, sweaty kind of, milieu of the place that they're in,
Hmm.
just like life around baseball, like how consuming that is for all these people. Again, it can be very corny and cheesy, but it all feels real and you want to go and live there. That's just how inviting this movie feels. And then Susan Sarandon, I mean, all three leads are amazing, but I think she owns the movie. Like a
Hmm.
character like this existing in a movie from that time, it just feels just so fresh and just so powerful. And then Tim Robbins, who's kind of playing this kind of idiot, but really, capable and talented guy. Again, amazing. And they probably met on this movie, Susan
I think
Sarandon and
so.
Tim
Yeah.
Robbins, probably.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But then here comes Kevin Costner, who I don't think I've seen this energy from him completely, where, or in other places, where he is the silent type, like we've been talking about, but who is capable. There's maybe a touch of arrogance, but there's also a sense of hesitation and vulnerability to him, like a lot more vulnerability than I've
Hmm.
ever seen before, to the point that there are even scenes of him being goofy. I've never seen him being like a romantic lead and wearing like a woman's robe and like dancing in the kitchen. Like it just made me smile so much just to see him like this, like wanting the attention of the woman, and but not admitting to it, but then really admitting it, because Susan Sarandon is the one who's kind of controlling this whole ecosystem
Hmm.
around baseball. So I don't know. This movie is such a banger. It's romantic. It's so sexual. It's so forward, but not in a will hit you over the head kind of way. It just feels so lived in and true. So I don't know. This movie is amazing. I thought he is just completely, I mean, all three are amazing, as I keep saying, but I think the reason this is a masterpiece for me is because I think he's firing on all cylinders, and he gets to show another side of his that I don't think I've seen from him, that side of vulnerability and goofiness. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're such a great, like romantic leading man. It's not something that I thought I would say about him, because I've always seen him in my mind as this kind of silent
Mm.
protector, Western guy, not very vulnerable or emotional. But you see all of that. And once again, it's kind of an homage to an actor from older times. And in this movie, actually more of a Henry Fonda. And I'll go as far as even saying Cary Grant, because he has just such
Mm.
charm and physical kind of vulnerability to him. This is a total knockout.
Home run is
Home
what,
run.
not, yeah, knockout. Yeah. Yeah. So I actually had never seen this movie either. This
Oh
is,
wow.
yeah, the two big Costner films I never seen was this one and Bodyguard. So I'm glad that you brought both of them in here. I definitely agree with you in the Susan Sarandon for sure is like, I don't want to say steals the movie because everything else works too, but she is the energy that drives this thing forward, and a role and a character that like I've not seen in a movie before. Like this very
Yeah.
confident woman who is controlling this entire sort of minor league baseball circuit. Controlling sounds Machiavellian. She's a major force in sort of picking the people that are going to be the next big thing to go up to the majors, and just with her confidence, but then also with the Kevin Costner where she can't be with him because she's already chosen Tim Robbins, and there's that sexual tension there between them. And so probably, yeah, one of the hottest movies I've seen in terms of that.
Mm-hmm.
Like the chemistry between Kevin Costner and Susan Sarandon, and just they don't make this in movies anymore either. Very wet as opposed to dry, is what I know we've mentioned that before. Yeah, like this movie is really fun. I agree with you about Kevin too. I think the vulnerability comes in the fact that this guy's kind of a failure. Like he
Yeah.
gets pushed back down to a lower minor league team, was in the majors for what he said, like 20 minutes or something, or one inning at one
Mm.
point, and that's all he ever played in the majors. And then at the end of the movie, he gets basically loses even more and gets
Right.
pushed down again. So I think that is something that typically he doesn't lose this much, even though he wins the girl in the end and wins a lot of other things with himself. But I think
Right.
that is it was interesting to see that side of Kevin too. He's not like this cool, confident, super successful, major league baseball player coming in and just showing Tim Robbins the ropes. He's really being used, honestly, by his organization to get Tim Robbins better, and then they cast him aside, and
Right.
he probably knew that was going to happen anyway. They're not hiring him for his talents, so that was very interesting too. And the iconography of Americana is like all over this thing. Like
Yeah.
everyone is dressing like it's the 50s, even though it's the late 80s. The cars are from the 50s. They use a lot of rock around the clock and all these other 50s rock and roll, early rock and roll stuff. So it really does feel like classic Americana in that way. Obviously baseball too, and so Kevin sort of fits right into that so well. Yeah, this is a really fun movie that I'm glad I finally saw.
Yeah. No, it just, I can't wait to rewatch it because how entertained and moved and thrilled I was just like watching the whole thing.
I just say too, it was fun that this movie. I also liked the world that they created on minor league
Yeah.
baseball. Like if this had been in the majors, I just wouldn't have been as interesting. I think having these be actual amateurs who are trying this, like this dream, which again is fits into America, I guess too. Like they think
Right.
that they're always dreaming bigger. They're thinking they're gonna make it to the promised land of the majors, but not all of them do. But they still believe that they might make it there, even though the chances of that are incredibly low for all these
Right.
players. So I kind of liked that. That world was super interesting to me too. That usually is not covered so much in films about baseball. It's usually always like the
The
majors
All
and
Stars.
the
Yeah.
stakes being a game, whereas here the
Yeah.
stakes are the relationship and like will I get to be chosen? And I forget the expression they used when they get pulled and moved up. There was
Yeah.
some cute sort of expression of like the go to the big game or something like that.
Yeah.
That I thought that was really cool, and they did a great job of building that world, but not distracting you from the character interactions, which I think is what
Totally.
makes this movie work so well.
Totally. And everybody's flawed in some way or the other. And yes, it's about being chosen and doing well, but I think it's also about just being in the world, like it's just living and which is again very American in my mind that yes,
Hmm.
people have dreams and aspirations, but it is also about the day to day,
Hmm.
people are kind of overcome by it. All right. So what's your masterpiece?
So my masterpiece, longtime listeners of this podcast are probably not going to be surprised when I say JFK from 1991. This is a
Mm-hmm.
film directed by Oliver Stone, starring Kevin Costner, Gary Oldman, Jack Lemmon. I mean, the list goes on. I could spend 20 minutes talking through everyone who's in this movie. Like everyone who's anyone was in this movie. And the IMDb plot summary, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison discovers there's more to the Kennedy assassination than the official story. So, like I mentioned, we did cover this film in our first episode about movies that shaped our view of America. I'll post the link down below to that discussion in case people want more of JFK than what we'll talk about here. So I'll focus a little more on the Kevin Costner aspect of this than just on the overall film. But like I mentioned at the outset, I mean, to me, Kevin Costner is like a symbol of America and the goodness that could be in America and our belief in our institutions being above all else, what is most important. And I think this character of Jim Garrison, who was a real person, but the way that they position Jim Garrison in this film and then having it and be Kevin Costner too, to me just is like really just makes this movie work. I don't think any other actor in this role it would have come across as someone who was potentially just obsessive, which he is, and maybe pushing for his own sort of sense of self-importance and celebrity, which maybe the real Jim Garrison, that was why he was doing this. But in this movie, you believe it is a higher cause, and that Kevin, and as Jim, deeply does care about this country, sees the Kennedy assassination as something terrible, that the president was killed, and is willing to admit or understand that yes, there are sort of bad forces at work here, the CIA, the military industrial complex, all these bad actors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that America's finished and America's terrible and America's bad. We as citizens can utilize the institutions, in this case the legal system, to shine light on the truth, and the truth will, as he believes, set us free. And if everyone just knew what was going on, then we can utilize America's constitution and laws in the right way, and fix things and be a better country. So that is what they position Jim Garrison in this film. I think that is what Kevin Costner means to me. And the centerpiece of this movie, I mean, there's a lot of them, but that end sort of basically like 10-minute monologue in the courtroom that Kevin is giving, just
Yeah.
saying a lot of the things that I'm saying, but much more eloquently because it's a script. Just really, again, just like works for me every time, and makes me kind of also believe in it too. He's convincing me, actually. You know what? Actually, maybe America's not so bad and that we can rise above these things. Yes, we've done bad stuff, but there's still potential, all these things, which is not something I normally believe every day. But every time this movie gets me in that sense too, where like, as Kevin is crying in that monologue, like it gets me as well, like towards the end of it, especially in that brilliantly shot sequence in the very, very end when he like turns basically to the camera and looks dead on to the audience saying like, it's up to you. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's up to me. Like I'm a citizen. I can save this. So I had to put this as my masterpiece. And yeah, what are your thoughts on, I know your thoughts on the film. We talked about it before, but in terms of the Kevin aspect of this and how he works in this movie for you.
Yeah, no, this is kind of the epitome of sort of what he stands for, that what we've been talking about the whole episode. And originally, I too had this movie as my masterpiece. And
Mm.
then, spoiler alert, I moved it to my wild card
Oh,
because even though it is sort of really underscoring, underlining the Kevin Costner persona and what we love about him and how he stands for the greater good and America and all of that. I do think that he's not really been a part of a movie like this ever, which is a big giant ensemble piece, a historic piece directed by somebody who's at the height of their powers, an all-star cast where Kevin has to go head to toe, head on head, whatever the metaphor is, with like
yeah.
the greats. I mean, first of all, rest in peace, Donald Sutherland,
Oh,
who
yeah.
passed away this past week as we're
Hmm.
recording this episode. One of the all-time great performances in the Steen ceiling scene on the bench as Mr. X. And
Hmm.
so, I think that's why this is a wild card for me because he hasn't done anything like this and he's great in it. Like you said, he's of course underlining his own persona, and the Jim Garrison character could be a stand-in for Kevin Costner. But I think what makes it a masterpiece and a wild card to me is that
Hmm.
it's missed this much grander vision. This is Oliver Stone's movie, who's living in a fever dream of being in the war
Hmm.
himself
Hmm.
and questioning and processing the trauma of being in the war and dealing with his own feelings about America and being obsessive and going down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories and all the stuff, but he's doing it through this movie. And to your earlier point, like I love when people use art to make a statement but also heal, and do
Hmm.
something. It's a giant experiment, and the fact that this is a hit movie with so much to say, controversial, and still stands the test of time, it's pretty incredible. I think it's probably Oliver Stone's highest high in my mind, but it's
Absolutely.
everyone's highest high. I mean, probably not Joe Pesci and definitely not the toupee, but
Oh, are you so good at this?
I know he's very good. It's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah. Right,
It's a
right. No,
lot.
it is. Yeah, but that's the
Yeah,
character. But yeah,
that's the
I
guy.
see what
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But everybody is firing on all cylinders here, and but yeah, the movie falls apart, I think, if you don't have Kevin in this role, who's grounds the whole thing, because the movie is manic and obsessive the way Oliver Stone is. And I think
Hmm.
you need somebody who's grounded and emotionally mature, but also struggling and overcome by all of this. And then finally that amazing scene at the end, like you mentioned, if you don't have Kevin in that, I think the movie becomes a bit of a drag. It probably would.
Yeah, and I think you raise a really good point too about the ensemble nature of this film. Like Kevin knows when to be the center of attention, like the courtroom
Mhm.
scene, but he isn't like stealing the energy or hogging the space from all these other like actors, old and new. When
Yeah.
he's sharing scenes with them, when he's not in the movie, you're not feeling his absence. It just he's even keeled when he needs to be, and then when he is the center, he can deliver that movie star performance and
Right.
movie star persona, but it's not distracting and potentially other. I mean, this obviously is all a lot to do with Oliver Stone as well, and
Right.
and the editing. But I do think another actor in this might have made the movie more unbalanced. I think Kevin balances it out without taking too much of what this movie is because there's so much here and it can't all rest live or die on Jim Garrison's shoulders, but in a way it kind of can because he's sort of like the center stone in this, where if he
Hmm.
doesn't work either too much or not enough or seems like he's this weird obsessive conspiracy guy, then the whole movie you can't, there's no one to rally behind as an audience member. Like he is your surrogate too, because again, like
Yep.
you, it is playing to this hegemonically dominant view that America is great in what it says, and yeah, there's some problems, but that's what the audience is coming at it from. So you
Right.
can't turn them off too much. I mean, you have to get them excited at the end when it's like, yeah, Jim Garrison, yeah, I believe in what you're doing. The truth is important and justice is important, and you're fighting for that, and that's what makes it powerful.
And I think to build on that, what cements, I guess, Kevin Costner's legacy through this movie is that for a long time, a lot of people who watch this movie, including myself for the first time, walk out feeling this is what happened. And what happens is very much tied to Jim Garrison's, quest for truth and what he stands for.
Hmm.
And guess who's playing that? It's Kevin Costner. So it sort of, cements this whole legacy that we've been talking about this whole episode of
Hmm.
seeing the greater good and being hopeful and fighting for the truth and all of that. So in many ways this movie kind of almost catapults him and his persona to a different level.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Which is why for me, like, not only it is my like perfect Kevin Costner like masterpiece performance,
Yeah.
and I definitely see why too for you on the wild card side of things. It is a different thing that he's done. It hasn't
Yeah.
really come back to this again. And I think it could have been like I was saying earlier, the fact that Dances with Wolves was such a huge hit
Right.
commercially and critically that he's like, okay, well, I don't need to be working with other top tier directors. I am one now. So I don't need to
Yes.
be in an Oliver Stone picture anymore. I'm going to make The Postman. Like that I think is you can read it as arrogance, but at the same time, like how could you not? Like you just won an Academy Award as best director
Right.
on your first movie, and now you have to be behind the camera hearing somebody else who probably hasn't won an Oscar because very few directors have. And then how would they feel being like directing you? And how much do you then want to put your own kind of stamp on things? Because you can see, and we already, your anecdotes about The Bodyguard, a movie he did not direct, nor did he write.
Mm-hmm.
He had a lot of creative control in that, making big decisions and make the movie work. Imagine that like as an Oscar winning director. Like I just don't know whether he would it's as easy to work with him. To no fault of him, it's just like how that dynamic to me would be weird. So I sort of see why that early taste of success with Dance with Wolves sort of put him on a different course where he's not going to be making JFKs anymore, which is unfortunate. I think his
It's
career,
too
if
bad.
if that movie hadn't been successful either commercially or critically, I think his career would have gone in a more interesting direction potentially. But I think, like I said at the outset too, like my thesis on him is just the culture moved away from the type of star he was, and in a quippy world, he doesn't really work. What can you say about the movie? Like for me, this is like a 10 out of 10, best edited movie of all time. Oliver Stone is one of my
Mm-hmm.
favorite directors, his masterwork too, and I just love even though it's 3 hours. I love coming back to this thing, and it was always just so powerful. I think one of the best movies ever made. I think
It's a
it's up
masterpiece.
there. It's just
Yeah.
so great. So yeah, if folks want to hear more about our thoughts on the film, like I'll post the link below to our thoughts on JFK more as a movie and less as the Kevin Costner vehicle. So yeah, you covered your wild card, which is JFK, and why don't we move then into my wild card, which is not JFK. It is another movie that is 3 hours though, The Postman. This is the movie that came out in 1997, directed by Kevin Costner, starring Kevin Costner, Will Patton, Lorenz Tate, and also Tom Petty, big cameo from him. IMDb plot summary: a nameless drifter dons a postman's uniform and a bag of mail as he begins a quest to inspire hope to the survivors living in post-apocalyptic America. So this movie, for me, I mean, it's in terms of wild card. I mean, this is a giant flop, like commercially and box office wise, and critically. Like this movie was maligned. It sort of kind of ended Kevin's golden period, if you want to call it. That was a lot of that late 80s, early 90s. But as a kid, rented this one day from the video store, not having really known about all the controversy surrounding this movie. And it really worked on me as a kid. And I saw it a couple times, like as a teenager, and always thought, yeah, it's like a little cheesy, but it's still the emotional beats and what it's trying to do and inspiring in America and the postal service and all this kind of stuff. It just worked on me. So it was like, okay, I want to talk about this. I'm gonna come back to it. I haven't seen it in like 20 years probably at this point, and see like what now, having known all of the backstory and the behind the scenes and how derailed his career for a very long time, like, how would it sit with me? And it still works on a certain level for me, honestly.
Oh my
I
gosh.
get caught up in it. I get it is long, but I don't know, it's like that super cheesy schmaltz of we're gonna make a movie about. And again, I love post people and the US Postal Service is great, but it's like it comes across as silly. It's like, okay, our heroes are the people delivering the mail, and it's that moment where he finds, because he's not a mailman, he finds like a dead mailman in a truck, and then he sort of puts on the outfit like, Batman sort of suiting up, and I'm like, yeah, the postman. Like, I don't know, it works for me in the scene when, he's the little kid is like waving the letter, and Kevin comes back on the horse and grabs the letter, and he's like, I'm delivering the mail, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know. It's not perfect. I can definitely see more of its flaws now as an older adult, but I see what he was going for. I think again, it's that, what does America mean and what does America stand for, and that is a lot of what this movie's about. And it's using the postal service, which is a apolitical bureaucracy of the government, delivers a service. Everyone, likes the postal service, and it is that sort of middle of the road. Okay, what America can do if we come together, we can deliver mail to different parts of this country because it is so big and so vast. And I don't know. It works for me. You loved it too, I'm assuming. I mean, everyone loves the Postman, right?
The movie or the person?
What, that's not the same answer that you're gonna give for both?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, this is where I think the cheese went bad. It's too much. It's sort of, if Horizon is one thing, like this really feels even more of a kind of vanity project,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it just so schmaltzy, and he's in every frame like you mentioned before, and just the concept of it itself is just too far reaching. I mean, I get what he's trying to do, but then
Mhm.
the fact that there are women out there who just want to make a baby with this postman,
Kevin
and
Costner.
exactly,
Look at him.
give me a letter, get a baby, great. It's just too much. Now the movie looks great. I have to say that about all Kevin Costner movies, is that Waterworld or this one or Horizon, he obviously has a great eye. There's no question about that. The movie looks great, but overall it just doesn't come true, and I'm never going to watch this again.
I'm not surprised. I mean,
Yeah.
it's 3 hours. It's not an easy sort of
No.
afternoon thing. I mean, yeah, like for me on this rewatch, and I'm not someone who likes post-apocalyptic movies normally. It's never really interesting to me
That's
about
my
what
other thing
happens
too. I just
after.
don't. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not my genre, but this feels to me more like just a typical Western of, a
True.
guy kind of man with no name coming into town, and how is he uniting the town against evil fascist army who's, trying to push like America in a different direction. I do also like, as cheesy as it is to the end, where like they're building up this big battle between the Postman fans and then this fascist army, and they decide, Kevin and the leader of that army, well, let's just fight one on one, and whoever wins just wins. We don't have to get everyone else into to a fight. I don't know. That still kind of works for me, but the ending just really doesn't at all, where like they flash forward and now all of a sudden everything is back and society's all right again, and they're like
Right.
unveiling this statue to Kevin Costner. I'm like, okay, wait,
Oh
what?
my
Like,
gosh.
the world's just better? Like, it was literally like there was no anything in this entire movie for like decades, and now all of a sudden Kevin Costner being the postman, we just go back to what it was like in 1997, but now it's like, 2060 or whatever. Like, that just did not work, and it went on way too long. There was like a whole 10-minute thing with there. I'm just like, okay, like this is a bridge too far for me in terms of the cheese. But the other stuff, to me, again, we're around the postman and delivering the mail, and I don't know, connecting people. It's cheesy, but it, for some reason, that works, but it does go too far for me. So
Yeah, I mean the whole statue and such. I mean, if that's not self-aggrandization,
yeah.
then what is? Like, you made this movie and you basically have your own statue. I wonder if the statue is in his house somewhere. Probably.
We should check on eBay. I think at this point he might be selling it to fund Horizon 3.
Yeah, probably.
So
Although I don't know who's gonna buy that.
all the Postman fans out
That's
there.
true.
They-
But you have to pay in letters.
Right, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. I also say too, like I mentioned at the outset, I just like the Tom Petty cameo, which is like so random, and that he's
Yeah.
playing like himself. He's playing Tom Petty in a post-apocalyptic society. That I'm like, okay, cool. If the world ends but Tom Petty is still around, even though sadly he's not anymore.
Right.
Maybe that's why we're in such a hellhole that we are. There's no hope anymore because Tom Petty's not with us. But that to me always makes me smile. I'm like, okay, cool, Tom Petty. Oh, you were famous once. It's like, yep, I was. I'm like, oh, cool. I don't know. That still works, even though it is cheesy. So yeah, this is a
Hilarious.
movie I would not recommend to people necessarily, other than just like a curio. I think, to your point, this is a vanity project, and he did overextend himself in terms of what he could do as a filmmaker, but more so as like a persona. I think this did
Right.
lean too much into the cheese, and coming more in the late 90s as we were, post Pulp Fiction where everything starts turning into like this sort of Tarantino type of like quippy and referential and nothing serious
Hmm.
type of film being what is quote unquote cool and no longer, the guy in the cornfield hearing voices and caring about baseball, like that kind of went out of vogue. So I think he was kind of the timing wasn't great on this, but also I don't think in 100 years people are going to be like, oh, the Postman's actually now good. I don't. I don't
No.
think it'll come around on it, but it is an interesting curio. And yeah, I probably won't see, maybe I'll watch it again in like 10 years. Oh, another thing too that was interesting about this one, I'll just note again, like there's a scene where he shows the Sound of Music and is referencing these older, the Sound of Music, bringing all the people together, even though they're fighting in these barbarians in this post-apocalyptic society. No, everyone loves the Sound of Music, and I think that again is an homage to these older epics as he's doing this new epic film, harkening back to those other older Hollywood films. That was again something that stood out to me on these rewatches, how much he was
So
referencing these
interesting.
older
Yeah.
films, which is cool. I always like that. The tip of the hat to Sound of Music, which is a
Yeah.
film I love.
Although
So
in this movie, because this movie just doesn't work, like that tip of the hat just feels super self-aware. It's
yeah,
sort of
yeah.
like, oh yeah, I'm just walking around and there you are with your letterboxed mic of like four favorites or whatever, and I have my answers ready for you right there.
Yeah,
It's a little bit of that, but that's only because the movie just doesn't work. Yeah.
right. So that was Postman. So now what do you want Kevin to do next? My answer is continue on Horizon and finish it.
Oh my
Yeah, that's what I
gosh.
want to do. I wish I could buy into like a Kickstarter or something where I'll pay in advance for all four parts to say that I will show up to hopefully get the third and fourth one financed. So I'm
Just
all in
buy
on
his
Horizon.
statue. That's all you
I
have to
should
do.
I should check on what maybe that's like the top tier of like the donors, how they have those things on
Right.
Kickstarter. If you pay the biggest level, you get Kevin Costner's statue from Postman. I'm like, nice.
I understand like what you've been saying, right? That he got success as a director so early and then that got to his head. But I do think this is where someone's character really comes. Of course, I don't know the man personally, so who am I to say? But
Hmm.
I do think he's had many chances to learn. Like most of the movies that he's made have not actually worked. Like that was the thing that worked. Everything else that sort of worked, even is sort of at the solid level, but not at that great level. You would think after like 30 years. How long has it been since Dances with Wolves came out?
That was 1990 or 91. Yeah,
Yeah,
so it's been like 30 plus years at this
it's been a
point.
long time. Like,
Hmm.
get over it, get on with it. And I agree with you. Like, he sort of is no longer in vogue, and that sort of changed as movies change. But
Hmm.
I do think there's always room for well-made art, even if it's sincere and schmaltzy. I
Hmm.
think he's in his own way. So my
Hmm.
wish for him is that work with a top-notch director, be in an ensemble piece, put on like a great character actor kind of role. You could even be an older, sort of wiser leading man, like him as what's his name?
Pa Kent,
Superman's. Yeah, amazing. I
that
thought he was
works.
so great in that.
Yeah.
And he's not the center of the whole movie, but what he comes and delivers, we are back in the cornfields, like great casting. I love that. So that's what I would want him to do, like work with any top-notch director, maybe lean into a little bit more of a vulnerable side, still be earnest, stand for the good. We need that actually. Like I think his message and his persona can be really powerful
Hmm.
given where we are at as a society. Just he should not be at the helm of directing that. That's my wish for him.
Yeah, you sound like you could be his financial advisor too, because I'm sure those people are pulling their
I
hairs
know.
out at this
Yeah.
point. But yeah, I respect it. But let's see what he does. I mean, if this Horizon project is completed, that'll take up probably another 2 years of his career and his time, and then maybe at that point, because he got that out of his system, which to me does feel like his magnum opus of like, this is when I want to leave. I mean, he talks about in many interviews, like he's not looking at opening weekend. He's looking at in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, this is now my art that can reach those generations. So he is thinking that grand. Maybe getting that out of his system means he is ready to step into the types of roles that you're talking about there, where he's putting himself in another director's hands and not being the center of not only just attention on screen, but also creatively behind the scenes. I think that's the
Right.
piece that you're correct on, and that like he is getting in his own way a lot in that sense. So
Yeah. Or if you're gonna continue with the Horizon stuff, like make him really good. Hire good people, good actors, like go toe to toe with some, not Sam Worthington, like
Sienna Miller was good in it. Michael
She's
Rooker was
fine.
good in it. I think there was some good performances in there, but I mean, I think I did feel there was a deficit of acting like star wattage. But hey, Thomas Hayden Church is in the next one, so just watch
Oh,
out.
great.
He's gonna light it up. Him and Giovanni Ribisi, so it's only gonna get better from here.
It's amazing. I mean, I kept thinking of Tom Cruise too, right? Like now we think differently about Tom Cruise, but like there's this period where all he did was these sci-fi epic movies, and I was like,
Hmm.
oh, this is what it's going to be of Tom Cruise. But zooming out, actually, Tom Cruise, given who he is and all of his beliefs and problems and everything, and superpower, superstar status, like I think he's handled his career, like the post working with every top director career, really well.
Hmm.
Where he's been in Edge of Tomorrow where he is the butt of the joke, but
Hmm.
ends up making it work. So I think it takes a lot. Like I appreciate and admire Tom Cruise even more after thinking about Kevin Costner as to how he's handled his career. But anyway, something I was thinking about.
Yeah, yeah. I think with Tom, it's just he loves collaboration and found
Yeah,
partners he can work with. Chris McQuarrie is the latest one. So it
yeah,
isn't his specific vision on everything. Like you never feel in a Tom picture, you never feel like he is the only force behind the camera.
right,
He wants to bring in other people and work with them. Like he does have very strong opinions and notes and things like that, even if he's not directing or writing the project, which he's never directed anything or written anything. But
right.
having other people around him, I think, is what makes him so incredible and not just being so full of himself that he has the answers to everything. Like, I think Kevin fell into that trap because of that success early on. So
Exactly.
yeah.
And even actors, right? Like when he started, like Rebecca Ferguson or all these people in the Mission movies, like they weren't everyday household names, but they
Hmm.
are good actors and they
Hmm.
bring their best. And he and the director, like they bring out the best from them. And now they are, everybody knows who Rebecca Ferguson is.
Hmm.
So that's what he does. Versus Sienna Miller will always be Sienna Miller, is fine. And the other guy with the long hair and many other men in the
Oh,
Horizon movies, where
yeah.
I'm like, which time period are you from? You're from like some Ralph Lauren photo shoot, that happened today.
Hmm.
It's just doesn't work.
So, in terms of coming up next, we talked about Costa coming up next. Why don't we get into what's coming up next for us?
So next time we have a new ScarJo movie coming out called Fly Me to the Moon, starring her and Channing Tatum. So it'll be fun to talk about the movie, but also talk about ScarJo, who's had an amazing career.
Yeah, we're going to the moon next, so that'll be in 2 weeks. So we hope you enjoyed today's discussion on Kevin Costner. Be sure to let us know in the comments below what your thoughts on Costner are. What are some your favorite films? Maybe we mentioned them, maybe we didn't, but we'd love to hear from you. And we're available on YouTube as well as all podcast platforms. So don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so. And also make sure to rate and review us as well, because that really helps new listeners find our show. So with that, Karan, I will see you on the moon.
See you on the moon.